Thanks. Chris Lecoq, editor of Bayou Wild TV.
We are Acadiana's home for news and talk. News Talk 96.5 KPEL, Brobridge, Lafayette, a Townsquare Media station.
Another battleground rally. I'm Jack Callahan, Fox News. Former President Trump heads to Wisconsin today for a rally where he's expected to focus heavily on the economy.
The views expressed in the following show are those of the hosts or hosts only. They do not represent News Talk 96.5 KPEL or Townsquare Media.
Welcome in to Savez-Vous on this Townsquare Media station. This is a public affairs program. We tell you what is happening throughout Acadiana, and sometimes our guests are not always smack dab in the middle of Acadiana, but they have a very solid connection to Acadiana. And this program is one of those days. We're going to talk about French, the French language on radio and media, and we'll get all those details. Our guest today is Dr. Noah Arceneaux. He is a professor at San Diego State. So, Noah, welcome in. Appreciate your time today.
Welcome. Glad you can have me.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so before we talk about the book you're writing about French language on radio, let's do a little background on you, if we could, please. So Noah Arceneaux, people hear that, and that's a common name down here in Acadiana. So people would say, wonder where Noah's from. Is he from Iberia Parish? Maybe he's from Mamou, maybe even the Lafayette area. So tell us where you were born and your connection to Acadiana with your relatives down here.
Yeah, definitely. Arceneaux is a very, very distinctive South Louisiana name. I was actually born in Texas, Fort Worth, Texas. My dad was in the Air Force. He eventually retired as a colonel, but I never really lived in southern Louisiana. With my dad in the Air Force, we moved around. We lived for a while up in Bossier City, which is near Shreveport, but I never really count that as Louisiana. That's, as the old joke goes, that's practically Arkansas.
Right.
But so my parents are Arceneaux from the Karen Crow area. My mom's a Richard. She grew up in Rain. So every Christmas and Easter, and then sometimes in the summer, we'd come down, and I learned how to hunt with my papa and Scott. I remember my papa taking me crawfishing, and I remember meeting people in Rain as well. And then as I got older, the trips to visit grandparents became less and less, but it was through all these frequent trips down to Louisiana that I became fairly familiar with the area. I still have some trouble with geography. People will mention a town, and I'll be like, I never heard of that. I don't know where that is, but I'm getting a little bit better with my geography.
I got you. Very, very interesting. Before we get into the book and how you got that interest in French language and radio, let's talk a little bit about your education background and how you got to be a professor. So what do you teach at San Diego State, Noah?
I'm in the School of Journalism and Media Studies. I've been out here in San Diego since 2007. So, I've lived a lot of places. I even moved around as an adult, but I've been living here since 2007. So I guess I'm a Californian, I guess. But I got my PhD from the University of Georgia studying mass communication. I've always been interested in, I'll say this, I'm interested in anything that happened before I was born. That's a weird mindset to have, but I was born in 1968, and films and media, TV shows from the 50s and 60s always fascinated me. And as an adult, I got my PhD. The kids that I teach, I'll call them kids, they're in their 20s, early 20s, they're all interested in social media. So we talk about different forms of mass communication, which includes the internet, which includes social media. I also teach a class about law and ethics related to the media. That's a very interesting topic in the 21st century. But my passion, what I like to research, is the history of different forms of media, namely radio. That's the topic I find most interesting. And about 4 years ago, I've been interested in French language radio for a long time. I actually did a couple of interviews back in 2008. But I really got serious about it 4 years ago and said, let's just do a book. Let me finally do a book on the topic. No one has ever really studied this topic, at least not in the past few years or past few decades. No one's really studied this topic. So let me do a book that just kind of like clarifies how long has this been going on, what stations are broadcasting in Louisiana, what stations used to broadcast, and what type of programming used to be done in French and what still exists.
I got you. Very interesting. Okay, I have to back you up. You said you got your PhD at University of Georgia. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
How big is Athens, the city where UGA is located?
It probably, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people, maybe less. It's a college town. I mean, it's a little bit more than an hour from Atlanta. It's far enough away from Atlanta that it's not, in my opinion, considered Atlanta. But it's this little small college town, super liberal, super progressive, lots of diverse individuals. But then you go a few miles outside of town and you feel like you're in the deep South.
I fully understand. Yeah, it's a beautiful part of the country, and I've seen the campus. Never been there, but it is very beautiful, as are most SEC campuses. Is it that wide, sprawling, what's called land grant university like LSU in Kentucky?
And the other thing that's nice about the campus at UGA is that it runs right into downtown. So I didn't even have a car when I lived there. I lived there for almost 5 years. I didn't even have I did my undergraduate degree there. Let me see. I did my undergraduate degree there in the late 1980s, and I didn't have a car. And you could walk to the burrito places downtown and walk to campus. And I was attracted to going there because it was such an interesting and diverse art scene, and there was musicians. And then when I got my PhD, that was about 15 years later, I knew the town. I knew that it was a convenient and cheap place to live. And the university there, the School of Journalism, is excellent. So I was very happy to go back. So I've been in Athens. I had 2 different stints in Athens where I got my degrees.
Got you. Okay, so I have to rewind again. And what I heard you say is, I believe you said you studied MAP, or here's and you teach it currently. I'm not sure if you said MAP, M-A-P, or math, M-A-T-H. What, MAP communication or math communication?
Math.
M-A-P. What exactly is that?
Math communication.
Oh, mass. I got you. M-A-S-S. I'm sorry. Well, that's what happens. And right now, Professor Noah Arceneaux is in San Diego, where he lives and teaches. So I apologize for that. Mass communication, I do know what that is, and I'm sure our audience does as well. So, okay, so very interesting. So you have this interest in French language on the radio. Is it strictly Louisiana, Noah, or are you going up to other French-speaking areas in North America? Like one area that comes to mind is Nova Scotia, but of course that's not the good old U.S. of A.
My focus is Louisiana, and also on the way the Cajun community has embraced radio and the way radio is used to sort of embrace and promote the Cajun culture. So that overlaps significantly with the use of French on the radio. Since I've been doing this research, I've now expanded into Texas. There are stations in Houston, of course, Beaumont and Port Arthur. Johnny Jono, one of the big Cajun music DJs, was out of Beaumont. So I would include sort of that edge of Texas in my research as well.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I'm not interested in Nova Scotia. I'm certainly aware of that. I know that that's where the Acadian French originated, and there actually have been some experiments to share programming between these Canadian or Quebec stations and Louisiana. But my focus is mainly on the Acadian region, which I would consider to be Lafayette is the center of it, up to Alexandria, no more further north than Alexandria, and then over to Beaumont, Port Arthur, and going the other direction, maybe to Baton Rouge. I know there's stations in New Orleans, but to me, that's not really Cajun country. New Orleans is not. It's Lafayette, Eunice, Mamou, Ville Platte, that area.
Yes, gotcha. Okay, so let's go back to, and I'm sure you've done the research on French in public schools and I don't know, I think that goes back to the 1940s and 1950s when speaking French and some of the attendees, especially in rural Louisiana, South Louisiana areas, had a challenge because sometimes their parents spoke only French. So tell us what you've learned about your research with French being a primary language back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. What did you learn about that with your research?
Everyone, I think it was actually back in the 1920s, there was some sort of either state law or state regulation that you had to speak English in school. That if you went to public schools, you had to speak English. And the classic story is kid goes to school, doesn't know English, only speaks French, and then gets punished or slapped with a ruler. Both of my grandfathers, now deceased, of course, that was the experience that they had, was they go to school and they get punished, and speaking French is something to be shamed or embarrassed. And everyone who's done sort of research on this kind of points to that as a tremendous disservice that we did to the local culture that really helped to suppress the language. And then when my parents were born in the early 1940s. They were only, even though they were both born and raised in Louisiana, they were taught that, speaking French is something embarrassing. Maybe it means you're uneducated to live out in the country. So they only grew up speaking English. Both sets of grandparents decided not to pass the language on. And then years later, we get KPEL, and which I think was in the late 1960s. And then people realized, hey, we've got this incredible local culture that has survived. We should preserve it and promote it, partially because it will help with tourism. Let's promote it for the sake of tourism. So now they've gone the other direction and tried to fund French immersion schools and bring teachers in to teach French, even bringing in teachers from Quebec, where they speak a different kind of French. Mm-hmm. But it's maybe funny or maybe sad, depending on how you look at it, that the state government realized they made a mistake decades ago, and now they're trying to undo that mistake. Can they bring back French in Louisiana? Probably, but it's going to be a challenge when for so many decades it was suppressed.
Yes. No, we do an excellent job with KPEL, and now there are French language immersion programs throughout Acadiana, so I'm glad to see that happen. When you talk about the French language and how it was frowned on back in the early 20th century, it's somewhat akin to old buildings. For example, there's the historic theaters in Acadiana, the Liberty Theater in Eunice. I believe it's the Rice Theater in Crowley, the Slyman Theater in New Iberia. Those are old buildings that were restored and preserved. And unfortunately, in Lafayette, we have the Jefferson Theater, which was a very long-lived. I mean, you had vaudeville acts in there in the early 20th century, and that building, that Jefferson Theater in downtown Lafayette, was torn down for a parking lot. So it's if you see my connection I'm trying to make. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but at one time it's just an old building. Let's tear it down and put a parking lot there. So that's a crying shame. And then in the years proceeding, if you will, or following when French language was frowned on in schools back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, then suddenly in somewhere probably in the 1970s, we began to say, hey, wait a minute, this is our culture. This is who we are. We need to be proud of it and preserve it. So very, very, very interesting. So I know you have spoken to a lot of people. In fact, the way you and I got in touch is that you've been speaking with Camille Doucet, who still does. He doesn't do a French program here on Townsquare Media, but he does French music, and he does speak a bit of French when he's on air. Yeah. So very interesting character is Camille. He's been in Cajun bands. He's been in the radio business for decades, many, many decades. And I know you've spoken to him. We're going to get your take on that and some of the other people that you've interviewed for your book. Do you have a title yet for the book? Or are you worried about getting it written, edited, and in final version before you finalize your topic?
I've been toying with a title. One title is French in the Morning, because stations that still broadcast in French, it's oftentimes put very early in the morning, like maybe 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. or something like that. And then another title for something more colorful is Let the Meatball Roll, and then colon, a history of Cajun radio.
I got you. Look, we're going to have to wrap up this segment.
Phrase.
Yes, we will continue our discussion with Dr. Noah Arceneaux. He's a professor of mass communication at San Diego State. Yes, that's in California, folks. So stick around. More Savez-Vous coming up. I am Mark Pope, your host. So glad you joined us. And stay with us, please.
For real foodies, there's nothing better than trying that new restaurant.
Eating America, 200 food banks strong.
News Talk 96.5 KPEL. Broadcasting from the Matthew James Tax Pros Studio. Find them online at matthewjames.com.
So, yes, we're speaking with Dr. Noah Arceneaux of San Diego State University, and your book, I like the Rolling Meatball. Give us that title once again that you're considering as a title for the book, Noah.
Let the Meatball Roll, colon, a history of Cajun radio.
I love it.
That's my kind of an idea. Yeah, and it's going to be focused mainly on Louisiana with a little bit of Texas.
I got you. Okay, so we mentioned Cami Doucet, and I think it requires a little bit of filling in the blanks and not just leaving it there, because Cami's been doing this for just a number of years. What can you recall? I know a little bit of his background because I see him on a fairly regular basis here at Townsquare Media. But when did he get involved with music? And especially, when did he get involved with radio? Because that is kind of the focus of the book that you're working on. Give us with history now.
I'd have to look at my notes. I think it was late 70s he started, and he kind of came about it in a roundabout way. He had some musical equipment, I think some amplifiers, some amps, and this radio station was doing an outdoor music festival, needed the amps, and so he was loaning him the amps, and then somehow ended up getting involved because he could speak French. That may have been a station in Crowley, K-A-J-N, Cajun, or
yes,
all letters were something like that. And then he ended up at KSIG for a number of years. And when I spoke with him, I was quite interested in when he spoke French and what kind of commercials he did French. He was from that sort of that old school business model where the person who's on-air talent is also going out and selling the ads. So he would find businesses, and some of the businesses wanted him to do the ads in French. When I asked him specifically what kind of businesses liked ads in French, he laughed and he said, places that sold boudin or crackling.
Right.
And he mentioned Early's Market in Scott. And I made a note of that. I was like, okay, Early's. And they would even have live bands play there. And then when I was just in Lafayette about a few weeks ago. What I love about coming there is that I always learn something accidentally.
Uh-huh.
Someone I was talking to just kind of offhand says, oh, New News. Oh, yeah, New News used to be Early's. And it was like a light bulb. I was like, oh, I know New News.
Yes.
I know that place.
Yes.
But it was interesting for me to make the connection that it used to be Early's Market, where Cami Doucet used to do a lot of live remotes with Cajun bands and then broadcasting in French. And then over the years, I guess he's been at KROF for many years.
Yes.
The ads in French become fewer and fewer. And now I don't think he's doing any ads at all in French.
Right, exactly. Well, he's still kind of selling his own ads, and he does throw in French phrases, and he may even make a statement, if you will, of fact or humor in French. So he does still speak French. On occasion, it's probably or somewhere around 10% of his program. He comes in on Saturday and Sunday mornings, and so it's not a huge portion of what he does when he's on the air. But
I think that kind of bilingual back and forth that's become more standard.
Yes.
And I have to admit, I don't even speak French myself. I keep meaning to learn it, but life gets distracted. We have other things that come up on our plate, and the fact that my parents never spoke it, and that I didn't live in Louisiana, I had no incentive to learn it as a kid. But the stations that do broadcast in French, like KVPI up in Ville Platte, they have this morning call-in show, La Tasse de Café. I think at one time that was mostly in French with a little English. Now it's almost all in English, and they'll do a little French. How are you doing? What's going on? But then it goes after that little bit of French. Then it goes into English. So I think that that kind of back and forth has become more and more common.
Right. We're speaking with Dr. Noah Arceneaux. He's a professor of mass communication at San Diego State University, working on a book, French Language in Radio. So, yeah, very, very interesting. You know, as you were telling us about, we were talking about Cami Douce, and I remembered to start out, I asked what areas you were focusing on for the book, and you said mostly South Louisiana, but it does go in some communities up toward Alexandria. And, you know, Ville Platte that's north of Lafayette Parish, and we kind of jokingly refer to that area as anything St. Landry Parish and above. We kind of jokingly here in Lafayette say they're Yankees. And so, but when you talk about Ville Platte, which is Evangeline Parish, and then you go north of that, Avoyelles Parish, which is where Edwin Edwards was born and raised. He began his political career in Crowley. Some people are saying, no, Mark, you're wrong. Edwin Edwards is from Crowley. No, he was born and raised in Avoyelles Parish. I do believe that Governor Edwards was bilingual. But anyway, it's interesting. But my question has to do with, you said the area goes up toward Alexandria, and it goes as far west as Beaumont. And I'm just wondering, down here in South Louisiana, we have this unique music, which Cajun music is unique, number one. And then we get even more unique with Zydeco music. And I'm wondering if these people who are doing French language programs, or at least partially bilingual, as you said, over in the Beaumont area, are they playing Cajun music or Zydeco music?
Oh, yes. Zydeco, that's kind of what I've been researching for the past few weeks, is very big in Houston. Very big in Houston. I would say sort of this I-10 corridor from Lafayette to Houston, especially from sort of Lake Charles and over into Texas, that seems to be like a Zydeco hotspot.
Yeah.
Opelousas claims to be where Zydeco originated. I would believe that. But Clifton Cheniere's first stuff was recorded over in Lake Charles. And I think he was even actually working in Texas.
Right.
So, yeah, I know Zydeco music is very big in Houston. And the first, just to go way, way back, the first examples of French language programming or playing of Cajun music, they didn't call it Cajun music in the 1930s. They just called it French music, was out of a Beaumont station, KFDM. And the reason I thought that was so interesting is, A, because it's Texas, but there was not even a station in Lafayette or Lake Charles until 1935.
Right.
So there was no local radio stations in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. There were radio stations all over the United States, but not in the Acadian region of Louisiana. So this one station in Beaumont realized that and was playing music, was targeting Louisiana. This department store in Lafayette, Abdallah's, is that how you say it?
Yes. Yes.
I found a newspaper ad for that department store from the early 1930s, and it said, listen to our ads on KFDM. So to me, that was a very clear indication of this Beaumont station may have been located in Texas, but it was clearly targeting people in Louisiana.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, there were 3 cities with locations for Abdallah's. It was mostly a clothing store, but Lafayette, New Iberia, and Opelousas, all 3 of those cities had Abdallah's locations, and slowly but surely, one after the other, all those stores closed. There are no more existing Abdallah's. So very, very interesting. Okay, we're speaking with Dr. Noah Arceneaux, professor of mass communications at San Diego State University. He's working on a book, French Language on Radio. Let's shift gears. A well-known personality in Lafayette. He's out of Lafayette. He's well known across Acadiana, and that person is Pete Bergeron, and he did radio for years on KRVS, the University of Louisiana. Back then, the USL station, KRVS 88, and Pete would do the news, La Nouvelle en français. He would do the news in French on a regular basis. Have you had interviews and interactions with Pete Bergeron?
Yes. And, I've talked with him more than once. He's very, very knowledgeable, has very, very strong opinions about many things, including the type of French that is most appropriate for the radio, which I was fascinated by. He said that he spoke a simplified standard version of French, because I know, even though I don't speak the language, I know that there are regional variations. The way they speak in a Boyles Parish is not the way they speak down in Golden Meadow. You know, locals, people listening to this radio show probably know better than I do.
Yes.
So to sort of not be specific to one parish or one town, he would go for a simplified standard version of French, and he said he would take great pains to enunciate every letter, not slur his words, not cut off words. So his manner of speaking was understandable by as many people as possible.
Yes.
But he felt very, very strongly, or he still feels very, very strongly about the need to promote and maintain the language. And he's not a fan of all these radio shows where they maybe play Cajun music, but the announcing is all in English.
Right.
In his mind, not the same thing.
Right.
No, in his mind, that's not the same thing.
And Pete, the cliche applies, Professor, and I know you've used this with your classes. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. And Pete Bergeron has the deep baritone voice. And you're correct. He's very articulate. I used to like to listen to him, even though I could pick up. Sometimes I could even discern what he was talking about. But I'm not fluent in French either. But Pete Bergeron is a living legend, and there is no doubt about that. I'm not sure. Pete's done it for decades. I don't think he's still doing it. I don't know when he stopped.
No, he's retired. He lives over in Tucson now.
Yes.
But he's very, very knowledgeable. And he also had strong opinions about the use of this term, which Mark, maybe I should have spoken to you before we went on the air. I don't know if we should be using this term on the air, but a slang term for Cajuns.
Yeah, spelled COON, and we'll leave it at that.
Yes,
and there's a tail end to that term. And it is derogatory. And it's unfortunate that minorities throughout the U.S. can use those terms that are considered derogatory about their race or their background or their heritage, and yet no one else can use them. We need to be uniform in that. It is a derogatory term. I don't think it should be used. I agree with Pete Bergeron. So, look, about 2.5 minutes left on this segment. I wanted to bring up another person that hopefully you've talked to. If you haven't, as you compile information for your book, have you spoken with Dr. Barry Ancelet?
Yes. In fact, he was one of the inspirations for the book, to be honest. Years ago, 4 years ago, I do a article. Most professors in my discipline, we publish in different academic journals, and it's kind of a short academic article, only read by other academics. It's not going to be read by the average person.
Right.
And I was complaining or lamenting to Barry. I said, I've got 10,000 words on this topic, French language radio in Louisiana. The journal is making me cut it down to 6,000 or 7,000 words. I got to cut out a fair amount. And he was the one, honestly, that gave me the idea. He said, why don't you go the other direction, fatten it up?
Right.
Don't make it smaller, make it bigger.
Right.
And I thought, he's so knowledgeable about this area, and he also knows the academic research about Cajun history and Cajun music, etc. If this man thinks there's enough material to possibly do a book, it's probably a decent idea. So I consider Barry sort of my unofficial dissertation advisor. If I were doing a doctoral dissertation, he's sort of like the sort of advisor in the wings. encouraging me.
Extremely highly intelligent, very well versed in his PhD is in folklore, I believe Louisiana folklore. He's a great ambassador for the Cajun culture and for Acadiana. So we are running a bit low on time as you glance over at your clock, Noah, and as I glance at mine. But you've got to make us a promise as you progress with this book, especially as you get close. We need to have you back on to do another segment. I know our listening audience is going to enjoy or has enjoyed this interview with you. It's really, really fascinating. Thank you for what you're doing, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of people interested in your book when you have it ready for a final production and publishing. So, yeah. Well, look, we're short on time, so I have to wrap it up with you. Thanks again, Dr. Noah Arceneaux, Professor of Mass Communication, San Diego State University, working on that book, French Language and Radio. Thanks again, Noah. Appreciate your time. Great information.
All right. Thank you.
Have you noticed bad behavior has become normalized at interscholastic athletic events? Some fans seem angry. They lack civility toward one another. Some even get aggressive and unruly. Time out! What is going on? This has to stop. Let's not forget, school sports aren't just about winning. And they're definitely not an excuse to take your frustrations out on the official or the opponent. They're about teaching lessons like perseverance, respect, and empathy, so students can learn and grow as people, not just as players. We all have a role to play in setting a good example for our students and teaching them these important values. So fans, it's time to step up your game and behave positively at interscholastic athletic events in Louisiana.
This message presented by the LHSAA and the Louisiana High School Athletic Directors Association.
Every day, Mark fights retinitis pigmentosa, a blinding retinal disease. But even while his vision is taken, his family gives him hope. Because whether he's helping run their business or enjoying time at home with his wife and sons, Mark knows he's not fighting alone. For 50 years, the Foundation Fighting Blindness has funded research into treatments and cures for blinding diseases, providing real hope to those fighting vision loss. And our nationwide community of local chapters provides networking and support for people with vision loss, as well as their loved ones. Because the best way to fight against blinding diseases is to fight together. And for Mark, winning the fight against vision loss means being there for his family. The Foundation Fighting Blindness. Together, we're winning. Learn more about how you can help us end blinding diseases at fightingblindness.org.
Welcome back to News Talk 96.5 KPEL. The program is called Savez-vous. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you're enjoying our interview with Dr. Noah Arceneaux. He's a professor of mass communication at San Diego State University, and he's writing a book about French language in radio. So one of the things that you mentioned that we haven't talked about, Noah, is Cousin Dud. And most people know that name as Dudley LeBlanc, who was a well-known Louisiana politician back in the 1930s. So tell us what you learned about Cousin Dud. He was doing commercials in French on the radio. And what else was he doing pertaining to the French language?
He started, he was doing campaigning and speeches in French in the 1930s on the radio. I know there's newspaper ads from KPEL. So he was doing it as soon as there were local radio stations. And then he developed weekly newscasts where he was taking a newspaper, like an English language newspaper, and translating it into French. And he did that for many years. It was like a regular weekly thing. It appeared on a number of radio stations. One of the most fascinating things I found doing this research was a letter from Dudley during World War II, where the U.S. government had told him to stop speaking French on the radio. Not that they didn't like the French, but they said, we want to approve in advance your script so that you're not sneaking information to the enemy. They didn't want anything other than English being broadcast on the radio because they wanted to review the scripts.
Wow.
And he wrote this beautiful letter, which I found in the U.S. archives up outside D.C., where he says, you know, the men and women of Acadiana Their sons and daughters are overseas fighting. Many of them do not know English. If you don't let me give the news in French, they won't know what's going on.
Wow.
And I cannot give you a script in French because I don't read and write French. He just learned it growing up. So just, take my word for it that I'm not passing information to the spies or saying anything negative or unpatriotic. And I just think that's a wonderful letter, and it demonstrates the necessity of people broadcasting in French, and how part of the fabric of America Cajuns really are. We're not some sort of foreign ethnicity. It's like we've been in America since the 1700s, since the beginning of the country.
Sure.
So, yeah, we're Americans just like everybody else.
Wow. Well, Dudley LeBlanc is especially interesting because he was the person behind Hadacol, the kind of elixir, cure everything, make more hair grow on your chest, make you a better man, a better person, more healthy, just on and on and on. I mean, Hadacol did everything.
He was a major advertiser on radio stations, and his weekly newscast included promotions for Hadacol. So he's giving you the news, also promoting Hadacol. It was mostly vitamin B, vitamin B12, with like 10% alcohol, so there'd be some effect from the alcohol. But yeah, he was selling that all throughout the 40s. I think he got out of that in the early 1950s. And as the old joke goes, when people asked him, why do you call it Hadacol? He would say, well, I had to call it something.
I'm sorry for that belly laugh. I hadn't heard that in I don't know how long.
Yeah, it's an abbreviation for the Happy Day Company.
Sure.
HAEAC.
Yes.
There's a reason it was called Hadacol, but he was quite the jokester, and then he even appeared on Groucho Marx's TV show.
Yeah.
Speaking in English, and Groucho Marx said, "What's Hadacol good for?" And his answer was something like, about $2 million.
Yeah. I've heard that one too. Look, he was a very intelligent man, but he was quite the salesman. And look, there's nothing wrong with vitamin B, but at least it wasn't just all what am I looking for? Molasses and that type of thing. At least it wasn't just all flavoring behind it. At least it had some vitamin B in it that had at least the one redeeming value. But you're right. He was very successful with sales of Hadacol, and he made quite a lot of money, and he had a lot of elected offices. Man, that would be a subject for a book in and of itself, Dudley LeBlanc.
I think Hollywood needs to do a biography of this man because he was such a colorful character, and he really, really did promote the use of French way before Codicil.
No doubt. We are out of time, Noah. We have to wrap it up. I wish we had a whole lot more time. Great information. Thanks so much. Hopefully we can get you back as you continue work on your book about French language and radio. I enjoyed it. I know our listeners did. Thanks again. Great information. Appreciate you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yes, indeed. Okay, stay tuned. Our interview with Lafayette Consolidated Government coming up here on Savez-Vous.
I heard the call to serve.